In 1898, following state elections, a white mob staged a coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, then the largest city in the state. They destroyed black-owned businesses, murdered black residents, and forced the entire elected local government to resign en masse. And if this is the type of content that you enjoy, you can find more content like this at OneMikeHistory.com. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon page in the description below. Also, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started.
Discover unbeatable deals and convenience at your neighborhood family fare supermarkets. Score exclusive deals, earn rewards, join clubs, and clip digital coupons for extra savings all in one place. Our exclusive offers bring savings straight to your card. Explore a wide range of local products that support your community. With easy pickup and delivery options, saving time and grocery shopping has never been easier. Family Fare is all about making your grocery experience easy and affordable and your one-stop shop for all your grocery needs. Family Fare in your neighborhood.
After the Civil War, around 1868, North Carolina ratified the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This resulted in Reconstruction-era politics in the South. North Carolina state legislatures and the governorship was then dominated by Republican officials. Conservative white Democrats who had previously dominated state politics greatly resented this change, and they felt that it had been brought on by African Americans and race traders. Newly freed African Americans were eager to vote and overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party, who had helped emancipate them, giving them citizenship and the right to vote. Reconstruction-era politics had barred former Confederate veterans from voting and holding public office in North Carolina. Many Democrats were bitter about the Confederacy's defeat, and these veterans joined groups like the Ku Klux Klan and orchestrated considerable violence at elections in order to suppress the black vote. Democrats would regain control of state legislatures in 1870. Democrats would then announce that local officials would no longer be elected, but rather appointed by the state. They would begin circumventing legislation by taking over the state judiciary branch and adopting 30 amendments to the state constitution. This included lowering the number of judges to the North Carolina Supreme Court, putting lower courts and local governments under the control of the state legislature, rescinding votes to certain types of criminals, mandating segregated public schools, outlawing interracial relationships, and granting the General Assembly the power to modify or nullify any local government. By adopting these ideals, the Democrats became the party of white America. However, the control was largely limited to the western part of North Carolina within counties that had relatively few African Americans. This brings us to the 1890s. Wilmington was the largest city in the state and a prosperous port with a growing, successful black middle class. Undoubtedly, African Americans still faced prejudice and discrimination, but 30 years after the Civil War, African Americans in former Confederate states like North Carolina were slowly setting up businesses, buying homes, and exercising their freedom. Wilmington was even home to the only black daily newspaper in the country at the time, the Wilmington Daily Record. With African Americans in the area growing into this newfound social status, racial tensions grew as they progressed economically, socially, and politically. At the same time, poor white cotton farmers in the eastern part of North Carolina were fed up with capitalism of big banks, and the railroads would found the People's Party, also known as the Populist Party. In 1892, with the United States in an economic depression, the Populist Party banded with black Republicans who shared in their hardship, and they would form an interracial coalition based on a platform of self-governance, free public education, and equal voting rights for black men. They called themselves the Fusion Coalition. Fusionists won every state election office in 1896, including the governorship won by Daniel L. Russell. Fusionists began to dismantle Democrats' political infrastructure, like converting appointed positions to offices subject to popular election, and they began attempting to dismantle the Democratic stronghold in the western part of the state. The city of Wilmington's Fusion Party was represented by the Big Four: Mayor P. Silas Wright, the acting sheriff of New Hanover County, George Zodiac French, the Postmaster General, W.J. Chadbourne, and the businessman Flavel W. Flowers. The Big Four worked in concert with the group known as the Ring, made up of about 2,000 black voters and about 150 white voters. The Ring wielded considerable power and money within Wilmington, as well as effective press through newspapers like the Wilmington Post and the Daily Record. The power shift horrified white Democrats who contested the new laws and even took up their grievances to the state Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did not rule in their favor, and when it appeared that the Fusionist Party was going to sweep the upcoming elections in 1898, this sparked a huge backlash, with Democrats desperate to avoid another loss. In late 1897, 9 businessmen, Hugh Gray, J. Allen Taylor, J. L. Fennell, W. A. Johnson, L. B. Sashler, William Gilchrist, B. P. Manning, E. S. Longthorpe, and Walter L. Parsley were unhappy with what they called Negro Rule and Fusion politics. They were particularly upset with the Fusion government reforms that had affected their ability to change Wilmington's affairs. Interest rates were lowered, taxes were adjusted, and railroad regulations were tightened. Many Wilmington Democrats felt like these reforms were directed directly at them. So these 9 men banded together and began conspiring to retake control of Wilmington government. Around the same time, Democratic State Party Chair Fernfold Simmons was developing a new strategy for Democrats in the 1898 election. Simmons knew that in order to win, he needed an issue that would speak to white voters. So Simmons decided to develop a campaign solely around the issue of white supremacy because he knew that white supremacy would overwhelm all other issues. So he began working with the 9 to execute this strategy. In March of 1898, Simmons met with Josephus Daniels, editor of the News and Observer, along with cartoonist Norman Jeanette and Charles B. Aycock at the Chautauqua Hotel in New Bern. They began working on a plan to execute the Democratic campaign strategy. The result was Simmons began recruiting media outlets sympathetic to white supremacy, as well as recruiting aggressive white supremacists to help in this effort. These publications presented black people as arrogant and disrespectful to whites. They labeled them as corrupt and unfit and constantly laid the same old claims about black men, alleged interest in white women. When Alexander Manley, the owner of Wilmington's newspaper, The Daily Record, wrote an editorial responding to claims about black men's interest in white women, stating that white women were not being raped by black men, but some willingly slept with them, he outraged many of the whites in the state with these pieces, and Alexander Manley became the target of a hate campaign by Democrats who started calling themselves the White Man's Party. In October 20th, 1898, the Democrats staged a political rally in Fayetteville, North Carolina. A group called the Red Shirts made their debut in North Carolina. The Red Shirts were a terrorist group that was created in response to Reconstruction-era politics with the sole purpose is to terrorize Republicans and discourage and suppress black voting. Wearing a red shirt became a source of pride in their resistance to Republican rule. On this day, red shirts marched in a parade with cannons firing and a brass band playing. South Carolina Senator Benjamin Tillman spoke, chastising white men in North Carolina for not killing that damn nigger editor, Alexander Manley, and bragging that Manley would be dead if his editorial had been published in South Carolina. And when it came to blacks, he advocated for a shotgun policy. October 24th, a group of prominent Democrats packed into Thalen Hall where Alfred E. Waddell, who is a skilled speaker and a member of Wilmington's upper class, delivered a speech declaring that white supremacy was the only issue of importance to white men. He deemed that blacks were ignorant and rallied that the greatest crime ever perpetrated on modern society was investing in the Negro with the right of suffrage. He advocated punishing those for enabling black suffrage and closed with, "We will never surrender to a raggedy raffle of Negroes, even if we have to choke Cape Fear with their carcasses." After the Thelen Hall speech, most of the group traveled to Goldsboro, North Carolina for a white supremacy convention. A crowd of 8,000 people showed up to hear Alfred Waddell speak with Charles B. Aycock, Thomas Jarvis, and William A. Guthrie. Waddell spoke accusing blacks of insolence and arrogance, which is only overshadowed by their criminality. He insinuated that black men were being disrespectful to white women and blamed the evils of Negro rule on white men who had been empowered by them to betray their race. Once again, he concluded his speech by assuring white men that they should banish blacks and their traitorous allies, even if they had to block Cape Fear River with their bodies. Waddell's speech was so inspiring to the crowd of red shirts, they left the convention to terrorize black citizens that very night. They destroyed property and fired on any black person they met, as well as kidnapping them from their homes and beating them in the street. Their plan was to terrorize Republicans to the point where they were not only afraid to vote, but even to register to do so. Democrats continued to put pressure on Republicans, and Republican candidates were too afraid to speak in Wilmington, and Democrats sought to further capitalize on this fear by arguing that a win by any other political party opposing Democrats would guarantee a race riot. Leading up to the election, gatherings like this became a daily occurrence. White newspapers would announce the time and the place, and sympathizers would offer free food and liquor in order to fire up the crowd. The rallies had almost a carnival-like atmosphere, and the groups began to disrupt black churches and patrol the streets, intimidating and attacking black citizens as part of a white citizens patrol. The atmosphere in Wilmington made African Americans extremely anxious, and some black men attempted to purchase guns and ammunition, but gun merchants, who were mostly white, refused to sell guns to them. Merchants would report to red shirts any black person who tried to procure arms, and some African Americans tried to circumvent local merchants by purchasing guns outside of the state. However, the manufacturer would refer the request back to the North Carolina state branch, who would then call in the order to the local Wilmington branch, and once the state branch learned that the local branch purchasers were black, the state branch would refuse to fill the order. Between November 1st and November 10th, merchants didn't sell a single gun to African Americans, but would later state they sold over 400 guns to whites during that same period. Newspapers would further incite people by insinuating that a confrontation was inevitable. Rumors start to begin that blacks were purchasing arms and ammunition and readying themselves for a confrontation. Whites would begin to suspect that black leaders were conspiring in churches, and Wilmington Democrats attempted to forbid blacks from congregating en masse anywhere. The day before the statewide election in 1898, Alfred Waddell would give a speech demanding white men do your duty. Look for black people attempting to vote, and if you find one, you tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, you shoot him dead in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow, even if we have to do it with guns. The next day, many voters were forced away from polling places at gunpoint or simply refused to vote at all. The Democratic Party would then sweep statewide elections. In Wilmington, red shirts blocked every road leading in and out of the city and drove away potential black voters at gunpoint. Fusionist Governor Daniel L. Russell withdrew his name from the ballot in New Hanover County and decided to come to Wilmington because this was his hometown, and he thought he might be able to calm the situation. However, when his train arrived, the red shirts would swarm his car and attempt to lynch him. Through all of the violence, Fusionists still remained in power in Wilmington because the mayor and the board of aldermen weren't up for a re-election in 1898. Later that day, the Nine had the Wilmington Messenger call for a mass meeting. The paper called for all white men to meet at the courthouse the following morning for important business. In the morning of November 9th, the courthouse was packed with 600 men and other prominent Democrats. Alfred Waddell would read a copy of the White Declaration of Independence, asserting the supremacy of white men and proclaiming that the U.S. Constitution did not permit the enfranchisement of an ignorant population of the African origin. Never again will white men of New Hanover County permit black political participation, and that the Negro should stop antagonizing the interests in every way, especially at the ballot, and the city should give white men a large part of the employment they're hereafter given to Negroes. The group then gave Wilmington citizens 12 hours to comply. At 6 o'clock at the courthouse, Waddell summoned the Committee of Colored Citizens, a group of 32 prominent black citizens, and they told the CCC of their ultimatum, instructing them to direct the rest of the city's black citizens to fall in line. The black men attempted to reason with the group and pled with them that they could not control Alexander Manley or what any other black citizen would do. Waddell simply responded with, "The time for words had passed." Alexander Manley was made aware that the red shirts were going to attempt to lynch him later that night. A friend gave him $25 and told him the password to bypass the white guards at the Fullerton Bridge because red shirts were patrolling the trains and the steamboats. Manley, along with his brother and 2 other fair-skinned black men, were allowed to pass only because the guards believed that the 4 men were white. They even invited them to a necktie party that was going to happen later that evening. The next day, November 10th, at 7:30 in the morning, Waddell gathered with 500 white businessmen and veterans to the Wilmington Armory, and they armed themselves with rifles and even a Gatling gun. Waddell would then lead a group to this 2-story publishing office of the Daily Record. They broke into Alexander Manley's building, vandalized the premises, doused the wood floors in kerosene, and set the building on fire. During the fire, a mob grew of over 2,000 men, and a rumor circulated that black people had started firing on a small group of white men almost a mile away. This sent the mob into the black Wilmington neighborhoods, destroying black businesses and property, assaulting black inhabitants with a plan of killing every nigger on sight. Waddell then led the group to disband the local elected government in the city. The group forced the mayor, the board of aldermen, and the chief of police to resign at gunpoint. The mob then installed a new city council and elected Alfred Waddell as their mayor. Once he was declared mayor, the 9 gave Waddell a list of Republicans who were then banished from the city. The next morning, Waddell and Wilmington's light infantry marched members of that list out of Wilmington, put them on a train, headed north with instructions to take them to the state line. In the aftermath, within 2 years, Democrats once again dominated state legislatures. North Carolina had imposed new laws effectively stripping black people of their right to vote through a combination of literacy tests and poll taxes, as well as prohibiting blacks and whites from sitting together on trains, steamboats, courtrooms, and nearly every other aspect of public life was made separate for blacks and whites. The number of registered African-American voters dropped from 125,000 in 1896 to only 6,000 by 1902. Gubernatorial candidate Charles B. Aycock used what happened in Wilmington as a warning to anyone who dared challenge Democrats. He stated that disenfranchisement of African-Americans would keep the peace. The Wilmington insurrection was the most successful coup in United States history. Its effects were felt well into the 20th century, with no black citizens serving in a public office in Wilmington until 1972, and no black citizen from North Carolina being elected to Congress until 1992. Even today, a lot of the people who participated and orchestrated the insurrection became immortalized with statues and buildings named after them. Charles B. Aycock became governor of North Carolina in 1901 and now has a statue of him that stands in the United States Capitol. Lastly, no one was ever prosecuted or punished for the violence or the death in the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy. This has been One Mic History. If you like more stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. Also, if you want to support the channel, you can do so at my Buy Me Coffee or my Patreon page in the description below. Also, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.